Now today, June 19th, represents the 145th anniversary of the Juneteenth, a national holiday for the African American people who spent nearly 250 years enslaved in the British colonies of North America and the eventual United States of America, because Virginia was initially a British colony. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, all those areas out there were initially British colonies. And it was in the 17th century that the British brought the first Africans to that part of the country as slaves. In fact, I took a trip just recently to Richmond, Virginia, and Norfolk, Virginia, and I saw the slave trails. I was there on the James River at the Manchester docks where they unloaded our ancestors from the boats coming from Africa, and where the trail led from the James River to Manchester docks through the trail down to what's called Shockoe Bottom, where they kept and broke, our ancestors so they could be acclimated to slavery. It's the same place where they had a burial ground that's now covered up by a parking lot owned by Commonwealth University in Virginia. And it was also the same place where Gabriel was hung. Gabriel, the one who had the strategic plan for initiating a slave revolt in 1800, where they had plans to kidnap the governor of the state and to set fire to numerous plantations and key economic installations and demand the abolition of slavery in Virginia. Well, the plot was uncovered, and Gabriel was put on trial. Well, he really wasn't put on trial. He was hung right there at Shockoe Bottom, and that area now, unfortunately, is covered up by a parking lot. And there's a group in Virginia right now that's working, trying to reclaim that sacred African burial ground in Virginia. Now, the holiday represents the struggle of African people to end slavery, legalize segregation, lynching, wage discrimination, and all other forms of exploitation and national oppression. In a declaration issued by the Union Army after the conclusion of the Civil War, with specific reference to the state of Texas, and this is where Juneteenth comes from, it says, quote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former slave masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor." And that was a proclamation delivered by U.S. Major General Gordon Granger on June 19, 1865. Now, why was this statement so significant? Since President Abraham Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation in August of 1862, it became valid on January the 1st of 1863, during the Civil War. Now, January 1st is celebrated, another African-American holiday, as Emancipation Day, which is a lot more widely known in Detroit, more so than Juneteenth. Juneteenth tends to be celebrated more in the South because it originated in Texas, and of course, you don't hear as much about it here in the North, but all throughout the South they have events on today that commemorate Juneteenth. Now, the fact of the matter was that the ruling elites of the Confederacy, those people who broke away from the United States to preserve slavery, were not about to abide by any executive order freeing their enslaved Africans from bondage in 1863. This was a proclamation that was imposed through the necessities of war in an effort to undermine the economic basis of Southern society and its way of life. In 1860, Karl Marx wrote to Frederick Engels saying, quote, "In my opinion, the biggest things that are happening in the world today are, on the one hand, the movement of the slaves in America started by the death of John Brown, and on the other movement, that is the movement of the serfs in Russia." Even though, unquote, even though the abolitionist movement had been in existence for decades, and the increasing rebellious character of the slaves became a serious factor during the 1850s, the late 1850s in particular, the ruling class in North America and in the North and the South were not prepared for the emancipation of 4 million Africans inside the United States. Although Lincoln had previously said that he was anti-slavery, his inaugural address in 1861 left much to be desired for the abolitionists. According to Bradford Chambers in his book entitled Chronicles of Black Protests, that was published in 1968, Frederick Douglass, the anti-slavery agitator and journalist, believed strongly in the inevitable emancipation of African people in the United States. This was after Lincoln was elected. Douglass had freed himself from slavery and would eventually travel to Ireland during the 1840s, where he would gain international support from the Irish national movement for the cause of emancipation within the United States. However, in 1861, Chambers recounts that, quote, Douglas's confidence that emancipation would come about fell precipitously in the months following Lincoln's election as president. Disenchantment began with the inaugural address of Lincoln. In that address, Lincoln announced his intentions to keep out of the affairs of states that permitted slavery. This is what Abraham Lincoln said at the point of his inauguration in 1861. Although he had previously opposed the extension of slavery and the new states being formed in the western part of the United States. With further reference to Douglas's attitude towards the Lincoln administration in early 1861, Chambers notes, and I quote, in his disillusionment, Douglas wrote in his monthly magazine that he planned to visit Haiti to consider it as a haven for black Americans. Haiti, the only place in the New World where black slaves had successfully revolted and formed a government, their own country, Douglas was scheduled to sail on April 25, 1861 to Haiti. Then on April 12th, which was 13 days before, Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina and the Civil War began, unquote. Chambers continues by pointing out that, quote, Douglas and other black leaders immediately began a campaign to convince Lincoln that, in Douglas's words, quote, the Union could never prosper until the war assumed an anti-slavery attitude, and the Negro was enlisted on the loyal side, meaning the Union side, unquote. Nonetheless, Lincoln continued to avoid the abolitionist demand to end slavery until the middle of 1862, when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation as a last-ditch effort to encourage the South to surrender in light of the threat to free the enslaved Africans, unquote. Nonetheless, it was the objective conditions on the battlefield, the pressure from radical Republicans in Congress, such as Charles Sumner of Massachusetts and Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, who along with Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists demanded that Lincoln issue the order to end slavery, as well as the international shift in the balance of forces between Britain, Russia, and France that led to a blockade of cotton exports to Europe, that eventually forced the Lincoln administration to declare an end to slavery and to enlist Africans in the Union Army. So this had a lot to do with the objective conditions that were prevailing at that particular time period. The economics of the South was being threatened, and at the same time, the Europeans were becoming more and more involved in the American Civil War. Now, according to Chambers, quote, fully as important was the international objective. By adding as an aim of the Civil War the abolition of slavery, the proclamation swung international opinion against the South and crushed its hope, and it was a very real hope, that Great Britain and France would intervene on their behalf. So those two European countries were actually considering intervening during the Civil War on behalf of the South to preserve slavery. Manufacturing interests in both these countries, deprived of cotton imports by the Union blockade of southern ports, were urging their governments to declare in favor of the South because their exports were being blocked as a result of the Union armies who were preventing the export of cotton by blockading the southern ports. The proclamation of emancipation rallied the workers in Britain and France in defense of the North for the abolition of slavery. This was key in the whole course of the American Civil War. Tsar Alexander of Russia sent his fleets across the sea to anchor off the coast of New York, ready to do battle if England and France tried to break the blockade of the South, unquote. Very key aspect of the turning the tide during the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865. Now I want to talk a little bit about the 13th Amendment and the status of African people in the United States. Despite the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery did not end legally until the passage of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1865, which Andrea read a little bit of prior to me coming on. However, the 13th Amendment would not resolve the national oppression of the African people in the United States. The question of the economic, social, and political status of the former slaves and their free counterparts was not solved with the conclusion of the war. Because in addition to the 4 million Africans who were enslaved in 1865 at the conclusion of the war, there was another 500,000, mainly in the north of the country. There were some in the south that were considered free, although their social position was very precarious.